Hello, so today I'm looking at The Pet Shop by Katie Grace, which was published in 2011 and was recommended to me very highly. Before we get into the review, I just want to ask you if you've read the book. The lead character, Stella, what does she look like? What sort of hobbies does she do? What's her personality like? What's her character traits? So the plot basically follows Stella James. She's a workaholic in an environmentalist company, and her bosses decide that she needs a little bit of relaxation and recuperation time, so they arrange for her to spend the weekend with a pet. Now, the pet in this instance is kind of a fetish, I guess you'd call it, in that it's not an animal, it's a person. They kind of play the role of a pet, not really so much of like a cat or a dog, but certainly subservient to their owner in this instance. And it's usually for a limited time, for a couple of hours, or in this instance, Stella is given Tino for the weekend. When she then has to return him on the Monday, she finds that he occupies quite a lot of her thoughts. She's really rather taken with it, more so than she thought she would be, given that she initially regarded the arrangement as sort of prostitution and was reluctant to get involved. But she eventually did, enjoyed the weekend, and then basically then starts to try and arrange to spend more time with Tino. What follows is quite standard and quite predictable romance in that will they, won't they? Of course they will. And then there are a few hurdles thrown in along the way, mostly contrived by behaviour that's a little out of character or an overreaction to the given situation. But it all creates like a hurdle for them to overcome before the next one. At the same time, you also have Stella's boss and his secretary. They're kind of behaving like they're secret agents in some sort of great clandestine mystery, really, but that's a little bit overblown when sort of all of the truth is revealed in the finale. But really the only part that felt a little bit laboured perhaps was towards the end, when both Tino and Stella engage in a little bit of homosexuality. And it's not that I'm prudish or anything like that, it's just that the book was moving towards a natural conclusion, and I felt that it might have been better served by just getting to it that little bit quicker, especially because the book really does move along at a pretty brisk pace. But I think it's all just part and parcel of this attempt to portray Tino as somebody that's so hot that he can turn straight men gay. I bought this book secondhand from the internet, and the previous owner had very thoughtfully dog-eared all their favourite pages, which was basically all the sex scenes, and it was pretty clear that just by looking at it before I even really read it, that was one every 2 or 3 pages. There really isn't any part of it that's laboured or dragged apart from that one slight quibble that I mentioned. It just very briskly paced story. With regard to the relationship that Tino and Stella form, it's well, 50 Shades of Grey had a little bit of criticism, didn't it, but from certain people that said it was more of an abusive relationship that it portrayed, and that Anastasia Steele was bullied against her wishes into this relationship that she didn't want to be in. I kind of can see what they're saying. It's not 100% something that I would agree with. But you don't get that feeling here. You get the feeling very much that Stella and Tino are both very willing participants in the relationship. There's a slight bit towards the end, perhaps, where Stella is a little bit reluctant, but you also get the feeling that she has enough agency throughout that if she was completely against what she was being asked to do, then she just wouldn't do it. As the plot sort of is wrapping up, it's revealed that much of what transpired was done so according to Vincent's plan, and that kind of, it doesn't really hold up if you go back and look at the way that he's behaved in certain circumstances, particularly the first big breakup, if you like, is caused by them going to bed together and then Stella waking up alone. She's really angry and hurt about that. So if it was part of Vincent's plan to have the whole thing leading towards having a relationship with Stella, then it seems very unlikely that he would behave in that way. And there's other little bits as well along the way that you think, well, why would you do that if you always had this end goal in sight? Just to give you a quick flavour of what to expect, I'm going to read a brief passage from one of the sex scenes. It is only a passage, and it is only from one of them, but they are very similar throughout, certainly in the terms of the language use, so this will give you a bit of a flavour of the whole book, really. She bent forward against the brace of his other hand, pressed low on her belly and forced her hips back, easing his path. and he was there right at the entrance of her pussy, pressed up ready as though he was leaving the decision to her. But as extra incentive, his middle and index fingers slid tightly up and down each side of her clit in a tetchy, wet pinch of friction that made her hump and shift, made her hold grip and pout, and when she was pouting open and aching, he pushed into her, offering up a trembling sigh against her ear. Which, aside from its slightly odd use of the word tetchy, gives you a flavour of pretty much what all of the sex scenes in the book are like. And I'm sure you're all now really desperate for the audiobook read by me. Now, the reason I asked at the start of the review what you remembered of Stella is because one of the things that I saw repeatedly when looking at reviews of this book, and in fact one of the editions has the book, says that the book is hot, hot, hot and has multi-dimensional characters. But I heard repeatedly how great the characters were. So what I thought I would do when I started was write a list of all the things we learn about Stella. And it didn't turn out to be a very long list. She is a workaholic. She works for an environmental company. She's considered by her colleague to be a little bit prudish or straight-laced, but really that would be a difficult case, I think, to make, given that her friendship with Anne is based almost exclusively on hearing Anne's stories about her sexual relationships, and I think that if you were a prude, then that probably wouldn't be the basis for a very long-lasting friendship. But what we learn about Stella is that we're told at one point that she has dark hair. We're told at one point that she has dark eyes. Now, that's not very specific in either of those instances. And then on another point, we're told that she has great boobs. But because we get those details so piecemeal, I actually wondered whether that was something that I could take at face value. Because, of course, a man talking to a woman is unlikely to be very critical of that person's physical appearance unless they were specifically trying to end that relationship, and even then it would be a strange and cowardly way of doing that. Yeah, it was a little bit odd, and I was unsure whether I could take that at face value, but later on somebody else says it's more or less the same thing, so you go, okay, so it's probably true then. So she's got dark hair, she's got dark eyes, and she's got great boobs. Not a lot of detail there. In terms of the personality, like I said, the sort of straight-laced thing doesn't really hold up to any kind of examination, and she's very soon in bed with Tino. She's masturbating on a bus to work and things like that. It's like, this is not a straight-laced person. And yes, there's a degree of sort of giving into a sort of animalistic urges sort of inherent in the whole pet shop idea, I guess. But again, it's not particularly hugely developed. If you're looking for sort of like a real psychological examination of somebody indulging in or addicted to a fetish, then this really isn't the book for you. But what this means is that Stella is kind of a blank slate, and I don't mean that with any kind of sort of negative connotations, really. It's simply a literary tool. There's been studies that probably actually post-date this book, because this book is 2011. It's a little bit longer ago than I thought it was. So, but they say that a woman is more likely to engage with the character when they're given as little detail about that person as possible, so they can see themselves in that role. And I think that that's what Katie Grace is doing with the character, really. Is she's trying to enable her readers to engage with that character in that way. And it's, of course, just one tool in your toolbox if that's what you're trying to do. The same way it would be if you were very explicit about how they looked and the things they liked to do, etc. And, of course, these books are heavily geared towards women, so if that study is correct, then that would be a very sensible way of making your book more effective and more saleable. As long as it comes from a place of creativity rather than a place of focus groups and committees. And I think from what I know of Katie Grace, that I really want to give her the benefit of the doubt there and say that this is her using a literary tool, that she writes these books from the right place, from a moment of creativity, if you like, rather than sort of just a cash grab. But we get very little about Stella, and we get slightly more about Vincent revealed through his two roles in the book, one as himself and of course as Tino, and some of the periphery characters as well. But when the details of your character are so sparse, then you do want to give a lot of thought to the name of that character, as that is almost all we get, and it's of course going to come with some connotations of itself. And I just, with Stella, all I get is sort of an image of cheap lager, really. Sorry, Stellas. And actually, it's almost worse when people shorten it to Stell, which is quite common in the book. And I mentioned her friend Anne before, and I thought perhaps that would have been a better name for your lead. I mean, if you Google famous Stellas, is that a long list? But famous Annes, you go back to Anne Boleyn particularly, for us this side of the pond. But also Anne Hathaway, not just the actress, but of course Shakespeare's wife. And then through the era of Hollywood, you have Anne Bancroft, Anne Margaret, and Anne Francis. It just seems like we are trying to create a little bit of glamour around Stella. I mean, she is our lead after all. Her job is very modern in working in an environmentalist. She's very much sort of a girl trying to make her way up through the ranks of the company. We don't know a lot about her lifestyle, but she's doing okay for herself. I mean, Tino seems quite foreign and exotic as names go. It seems like a really good choice. But perhaps Katie Grace should have just swapped Stella and Anne around. Likewise, when you're trying to create a degree of sexuality about your story, we're told quite a lot about some of the smells while they're making love, and it's usually of a salty or a briny or a seashorey nature. And I'm sorry, that just starts to sound, a little bit fishy, doesn't it? It's not a great sexual image. But then we're also told occasionally about sort of a yeasty smell. And I'm sorry, I'm a man, I know nothing. But when you hear vagina and yeast, it starts to get a little bit grim. Perhaps those smells aren't helping the story either. So just wrapping up, I think if this is your first foray into the genre, then would you choose this? Would you choose 50 Shades of Grey? I think that James tries to do a little bit more with her character. We learn a little bit more about Anastasia still. But then you might simply not engage with what you've learned. So it's not good or bad. It's not better or worse. It's just a trade-off, really. And that you're much more likely, I think, to engage with Stella for the reasons that I've already mentioned. And on top of that, I think that this book, it moves along in a much brisker way than the 50 Shades of Grey did. So there's another reason perhaps to side with this one. With regard to if you're just in it for the sex, then I think that the Pet Shop has more. I think it gets to it quicker, very small gaps between those scenes. I think it's probably a little bit cruder in execution. Perhaps you might call that more explicit, but they're both fairly explicit, I think. So it's just that type of language is perhaps, in Katie Grace's instance, a little bit coarser, perhaps is a better word. But largely based on the fact that it is the shorter text, I think that alone makes Katie Grace's text the more accessible of the two. And it's certainly the only book that I've ever read that has the line, "I'm sorry, mate, I came on your palate." So there's a degree of tongue-in-cheekness about it as well, I think, that 50 Shades just doesn't really have. This is not a genre I read a lot in. I only tend to read these books when people recommend them to me. But there's nothing that's particularly bad about The Pet Shop that would make me hesitant to recommend it to you if you were interested in trying something from this genre. There's nothing really bad about it, but then there's nothing that's so good that you're likely going to remember it 6 months after you finished reading. Does The Pet Shop deliver what it sets out to? I believe that it does. Therefore, within the realms of the genre, it is recommended. Thanks for watching.